Okay, I don't want to waste time because I need to finish a bit early today because you have a lot of things going on this afternoon, I guess. The second thing is there are two concepts that I wanted to go into. The first one is non-violence. I'll briefly go into this concept. I have sent you my slides. You can read on that. If you want to excel on that, we have a course which is offered for the IPS and IPS media students. You can come to that course. If not, there is also an online course which we give on civil resistance and non-violence. So you can do that. If you are more interested, I can also recommend a lot of free courses. And this is a very important concept, especially for the student of peace and conflict studies. Primarily because obviously we only talk about violence, but there is also another method called non-violence, which works much better than how violence works, right? Because people waste conflict, or people waste armed conflict, or people waste violence in order to address their needs. That's the primary reason. But obviously, it would much better if we also use non-violence. There is always a kind of this, kind of a wrong image of non-violence that it does not work. But in fact, most of the major conflict that we see in this world has been addressed with the use of non-violence. Just to give an example, the civil rights movement in America, right, where Martin Luther King exactly devised this method. The whole Satyagraha movement in India, which was launched by Mahatma Gandhi, non-violence. Okay, so I'm just trying to give you a kind of a rubric in terms of how it works. Basically, the whole concept of non-violence is non-cooperation. Because as we know that as a member of a society, we cooperate with our leaders, right? We abide by the law. We abide by the rules and regulation, right? So basic hypothesis is to work on that one. So as you see, political power is based on cooperation, right? Either it's a dictator or anything, we just simply cooperate, right? That's why they can rule on us. So this is the whole thing, right? So, and this cooperation can be broken. Okay? So no elite can remain in power without cooperation from below. So this is the more widespread, whole philosophy of Gandhi. He looked into why we are basically obeying, whatever the British are telling us. Right? So that was the whole hypothesis in terms of if we do not cooperate, they cannot really rule us. So how do we break this? So that was the whole thing. So that the whole salt march, all this thing really happened of that. So basically, there are different forms of power. So for example, tax paying is one of the power. That's how the state basically, runs or function, because we're paying taxes. So if we stop paying taxes, then we work for the government, right? There are military services, which basically serves the purpose of government. Then there are also police, which basically maintains law and order. Then there is a civil obedience, means all of the citizens, we follow the rules and regulation, the state basically devised. And there are bureaucracy. So if we start not paying taxes, if we stop obeying the government, if we start disobedience, which is the whole formula of non-violence, then obviously, the bureaucracy also stop to work, right? And then you can start seeing some fractures over there also, which basically supports the power, right? And this is how it crashes. So most of, Gandhi's revolution, or the civil rights movement in America, or the solidarity movement in Poland, or Red Revolution, Orange Revolution. There are so many revolutions. Even recently we saw in Hong Kong, the Umbrella Revolution. This is the whole hypothesis in terms of how it should work, okay? There are a lot of, there are almost 193 ways of civil disobedience and use of non-violence. In fact, this was the whole hypothesis of Gene Sharp, which basically gave the scholarly, outreach to the non-violent action. So, these are some of the ways in terms of there are 193 methods. So this all comes in all those. Right? So these are some of the activities that you can do. The alternatives that we have, the power that we have in the citizen. Right? So has it worked? Obviously, there are many cases. There are many cases. Every day there are many examples of this, but obviously the media really do not portray it on that way. So that is the whole reason why we're not really listening to or really, kind of getting example of this. But obviously this is happening every day in our society, everywhere, all over the world. And this is working, okay? So I just wanted to stop there because I wanted to go on to the next slide. Gerardo, can you put on the next slide? Yes. So today I'm going to talk about conflict analysis. This is one of my favorite subjects. I can speak 24 hours on this topic because this is what I do basically in my life. As a political analyst, I was doing this when I started my career. I'm doing it now as a student of peace and conflict studies. I did this when I was also a student in international relations. That's what they do. International relation is all about looking into cooperation and conflict. So what you do is to analyze who are your enemy, who are your friends, right? So that is also a kind of an analysis that you do. And then, you also do it every day in your life in terms of really analyzing, right? All your options that you have. So analysis, and especially conflict analysis, is very close to my heart. It's very pity that we only have one day on this, and 1 hour I can speak on this. But there is an online course that I teach. In fact, I'm teaching at this point of time, which I address this topic for in 3-credit course. So I don't want to go on this so much. You already know about this, I think. So conflict assessment and mapping, some call it conflict mapping, some call it conflict assessment, some call it conflict analysis. There are different taxonomy which is basically used in this, basically to denote this term. Well, obviously, all these terms are very close. So I basically use conflict assessment or sometimes conflict analysis. It's basically a tool to find out the root cause of conflict. Basically to analyze, the rubric of the conflict, how it's happening. According to International Alert, breaking news, conflict assessment or analysis is identification and comparison of position, values, aims, issues, interests, needs of the conflict parties. So this is a kind of a holistic definition in terms of how they wanted to define conflict analysis. And in fact, International Alert is one of the prominent institutions which basically do their entire work is about conflict analysis. They basically map all the conflict all over the world. So contemporary conflict analysis originated from the evolution of other broader fields, such as conflict prevention, peace building, development cooperation, and humanitarian assistance. So if we really talk about the history of conflict analysis, how it really started, we really need to go back to other various fields where we're basically using conflict analysis for a very long period of time. So if we really look into detail, there are two-fold desires in terms of development of this field. Basically to understand the nature of contemporary conflict in order to prevent them. Basically, if we really wanted to deal on any conflict, or if we want to work in any conflict, obviously we need to understand that conflict, right? We really need to understand inside out regarding how the conflict is really functioning. What is the root cause of this conflict? Who are the parties involved in this conflict? Who are the primary parties? Who are the secondary parties? What are their interests? So unless and until we can understand that, obviously we cannot really intervene on that conflict, right? So that is basically the first line for us to really work on that conflict, right? And then obviously the second is to avoid unintended and perverse effect of activities of external intervention originally aimed at improving the situation. Not only conflict analysis is being used just to deal on conflict. For example, even in the humanitarian assistance, we do conflict analysis. We just want to understand if somebody is, for example, giving some humanitarian aid, whether that humanitarian aid is really doing good, or it is also kind of facilitating some other conflicts in the society, right? So we also need to understand that. For example, I can give you a very good example. In 2015, we had an earthquake in Nepal. So Nepal was completely devastated. Some portion of Nepal was completely devastated. So at that time, the first line of people who went into intervention, or the government put the military into intervention into that situation, right? Usually, whenever there is a humanitarian crisis, obviously it's either the police or the military who first go into the situation to help people, right? imagine if we were, and obviously we are in a conflicting situation, obviously military will have a biased approach in terms of helping people, right? Obviously they will only support those people who are favoring them or who feel that they are their allies, right? And then obviously they will completely neglect those people whom they think is their enemy. Right? So there is always a kind of a biased approach in terms of how humanitarian aid also operates if you put military into perspective, and especially in the conflicting situation, right? Because there is always a biased approach in terms of whom to support and whom not to, right? So obviously, even though intervention is a good cause, right? So we trusted the military to work on that, but there is a kind of a critical angle in terms of really looking whether the military is really working for the right people or not, whether they are really going and dealing on the situation or not. We can also take an example of Philippines in terms of how now the Philippine police is really operating in Philippines in the broader set, right? So if there is a humanitarian context, then there is always a kind of a biased situation. And especially military and police forces are always a political institution. They've always been politicized in some way or others, and they are always becomes a government tool in terms of intervention. Right? So there is always a kind of a degree of biasness, right? Even though we are doing good to people, but not necessarily the things really work so well in those kind of situations. And even in the broader humanitarian aid which is provided by the countries, different countries, that is also has the same kind of an impact in terms of whom they decides to give this humanitarian aid. Right? So there is always a biased approach. I think now we have a conflict, and especially the United Nations has a conflict in Myanmar regarding the Rohingyas, because the Myanmar government is basically blocking all the aid coming for them, right? So there is always a degree of biasness, and then this whole humanitarian package also kind of creates a kind of a division among people, right? So whether the humanitarian aid or the humanitarian work that we are doing is really helping people, or this is a source of conflict, right? So that is also another thing that we do. So there is this whole field of do no harm, conflict sensitivity approach that is also embedded within the field of conflict analysis. So in terms of the historical overview, basically the conflict analysis field really started basically around Cold War. And at that time, basically, scholars of international relations and peace and conflict studies were also trying to understand in terms of the different positions of the superpowers at that time and their allies, because obviously the superpower were not really fighting within themselves, but they were kind of fighting a kind of a proxy war. So basically, at that time, especially the field of international relations really used game theory and strategic thinking in terms of really trying to analyze, how the conflict is really evolving in different parts of the world. Okay. Then it further developed in 1990s, because after the end of the Cold War, we started seeing different internal conflicts all over the world. Then basically this field also kind of started growing and developing, and then really it came out of the international relations field, and then it kind of became a basic tool for the peace and conflict studies. And basically our scholars really developed this. So there was a rise of interstate conflict. Then obviously interstate conflict had different causes. For example, ethnicity was one conflict component of contention. Access to political power was another contention. There are various plethoras of different causes of conflict, right? It was not, during the Cold War, obviously there was basically a proxy war. There was a kind of an ideological war. But after that, when we see a rise of interstate conflict, there are multiple of causes that started emerging in terms of why people fight with each other, right? So then we try to understand this. Then I talked about greed and grievances debate, which was basically put out by World Bank, and especially Paul Collier and Ankley Hoffler, who talked about how people rebel, and then they gave this idea that either it's a greed or grievances, right? So that was whole hypothesis that was laid. Then the United Nations worked into the concept of human security, which was also embedded in this concept. Then in the development field, especially in the development field, there was another aspect that was been arising, and especially World Bank started talking about development and security. Whether we need security first to develop people, or development is the one which basically secure people. So this was a kind of a chicken and egg problem in the development world. So this development and insecurity concept really started to emerge. Then obviously with the humanitarian aid and everything, in terms of how humanitarian aid is basically been devised or been handled, and how development is handled, then we started seeing the concept of do no harm, and then the conflict sensitivity. Then around 2000, obviously, then the agenda also started kind of expanded. For example, woman, peace and security was a concept which was basically been put forward. Then the field of conflict analysis started seeing how the same conflict have a different effect to men and women and children, because obviously this, they are living in the society, but the impact that a conflict has to male with regards to female is completely different, and with regards to children is completely different. So now we're trying to, kind of analyze the impact of conflict in a separate dimension, not as a kind of a holistic, because obviously, the impact is quite different, and we started seeing a difference of impact in different genders and also, different generations, right? Then around the same time, the United Nations and the World Bank, they started talking about governance and state capacity. So that was also another angle of conflict analysis. And now we are around, focusing on conflict dynamics, how conflict really evolves, especially the rise of terrorism and everything. We started seeing, from the system perspective. And then we are now talking about more inclusiveness and participation in terms of, whenever we go and doing a conflict analysis in any society, obviously, we're not really talking people at journal. Now we also see different differences that is existed in the society. For example, if we want to do a conflict analysis in El Radio, obviously there are, I think El Radio has different communities. They have different ethnicities. Right? There are different group of people. How the conflict really impacts to different people, right? For example, coming from outside and living here has a different view of conflict and different impact of conflict vis-a-vis the people who are living inside that community or who are that part of the community, right? So obviously this difference needs to be analyzed. Okay. So if we see how conflict analysis is done, obviously there are three realms in which conflict analysis is done. Obviously there is a field within the scholarly realm which also does conflict analysis. There is policymakers, they also do kind of a conflict analysis on their realm. And then obviously in the praxis realm also we have conflict analysis. So basically the field of conflict analysis can be divided into these three realms. On the scholarly realm, there are three basic schools of thought, as far as I can attest. The first school of thought is called conflict dynamic model. Basically, this was a kind of an emerging schools of thought doing conflict analysis. It just started during the Cold War, and basically that field, that school of thought basically used game theory, and then later on, Johan Galtung also talked about this, his ABC triangle, that's very famous. So that is being used in conflict dynamics model. Then there is a need-based approach to conflict analysis, and some of the scholars who worked on was Louis Corser, John Barton, Edward Ezar, and Johan Galtung, were the contributors in that schools of thought. And basically, need-based approach basically talks about the needs of the people and why those needs were not being met. So that is the reason why people basically and there is a grievances. So in order to fulfill those needs, it's just basic. Its entire theoretical base is based on the Maslow's need hierarchy need. So it basically talks about the Maslow hierarchy need in a different perspective. Looking from the basically analyzing the conflict. Using that as a kind of a theoretical framework. And then there is another field which is basically developed, which is rational statistic calculation. Rational statistic calculation basically talks about how conflict is a kind of is basically a calculation of each actors based on the options they had. It's not that people are willing to use violence, but they are compelled to use violence because at some point at some stage they really need to make voice in order to really draw attention of the people. For example, to give you an example, when Tamil Eelam started their conflict in Sri Lanka, they in fact first used a non-violent methods. So they were kind of protesting. They were basically going through all the non-violent methods and strategies they were using, but it was not being very effective, and nobody was really giving attention. So then they switched the strategy because they didn't have any options. Obviously, they had a grievances, and these grievances were not being fulfilled and not being taken into consideration by by international actors, and nobody was really taking them very serious. So then they devised into violent strategies. So there was a kind of a calculation in terms of how they switched from non-violent strategies to violent strategies, right? So that was based on their own calculation in terms of how far they can go with different strategies they have on their hand, right? So basically they talk about this. It's also very important in order to understand this this decision-making process within each of this group, because that basically help us later on to also intervene into this conflict. And some of the scholars who talks about this is I. William Zartmont, Rosa Fischer, and William Moody, and John Stedman. So these are some of the theoretical framework that are there in terms of understanding conflict from a theoretical perspective. If anybody of you are interested, I'm more than happy to explain that. You can come to my office. We can discuss more on this. My entire PhD is on this, so I'm more than happy to talk 24 hours on this one. Different theoretical framework, how we can use that, and how this is very important. On the policy realm, obviously, this is basically a kind of for the work of diplomats and diplomacy. Basically, diplomats and diplomacy basically use conflict analysis, and basically any ambassador's work or any embassy work is basically analyzing things, right? For example, if an embassy in the United States is here in Costa Rica, basically that embassy is really looking at their interest in this country. So what they are doing is they are basically day-to-day basis, there are people who are assigned within the embassies to basically analyze things which is going in this country, right? So one of the biggest analysis they do is about the political analysis in terms of who is going to win the next election, right? Because they really need to know that Costa Rica is having the election next year. So which political party is going to win that election, so that they can prepare themselves, they can already start kind of approaching these people who is going to win, who is going to be the probable next leader, so that they can have a very good relationship, so that they can serve their interest. They fulfill their interest, right? So that is a kind of a big analysis that they do. Out of that, other than that, they also do a kind of an economic analysis in terms of how they can serve the economic interest. So there are various, they also do kind of a security analysis in terms of the various security risks that is posed by this country to United States, for example, refugees, flow of people, migration, right? So this, and also the sea that they share, the ocean that they share, right? So all this analysis is done by the embassies. So the entire work of diplomacy is this one, They basically do analysis, right? The work of diplomats is to do analysis. The work of diplomat is to basically, do, all the analysis of that country which he or she is responsible of. So that their entire job is 24/7 on this one, right? There is also another angle to look into this. Basically, superpowers are very prominent countries. Basically, they also have their own foreign policy doctrine, right? So foreign policy doctrine is a kind of a doctrine that is being produced by a nation state, basically analyzing their interest, basically analyzing the cooperation that they have, so their allies, who are the potential allies, who are working with them, and then also analyzing their conflict. So basically conflict is their interest, right? So also their interest. So basically, if you look into the American government or the British government, or even now European Union do it combinedly, but some individual country like Germany, France, China, Russia, what they do is they take out these white papers, whatever it is called, right? Some call it white paper, some call it green paper, some call it yellow paper, which basically outlines their foreign policy objectives. And it basically kind of guides them in terms of how they wanted to operate in next 2 years or 10 years or 20 years. It's a kind of a blueprint in terms of how they wanted to operate. For example, recently we had an election in America. So now, basically, the Trump administration has already outlined in terms of what it wanted to see itself in coming 4 years, what it wanted to achieve, how it wanted to operate in defense, where are its priorities, where it wanted to put its resources, right? So these are always been outlaid. So so conflict analysis is much more done in the diplomatic side. At the same time, not only the Foreign Office or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the State Department does, at the same time they also have this aid agency which is attached to them, right? And especially big countries have their own aid agencies. For example, the US has USAID, the British has DFID, the Swedish has SIDA, the Canadian has Canadian CIDA, SIDA, right? So that is also another arm of diplomacy. Right? Obviously, their objective is giving aid to developing countries, but at the same time they also go in hand with the State Department in terms of fulfilling the objectives, right? So we cannot really separate these two, arms, right? And at the same time, there are also other international organizations like Save the Children, which operates globally. United Nations, it's an intergovernmental organization. World Bank, or big NGOs like CARE International, Save the Children, Action Aid. So this also needs to basically kind of do analysis of various aspects of conflict, which is going all over the world. For the bilateral organization, it's basically doing analysis of the country where they are operating. But for the multilateral organization, obviously, their role is to analyze things wherever they are working, right? So that is also their biggest role, is to do analysis. There is sometimes this is a kind of a fallacy that sometimes diplomacy has. Sometimes we also see a kind of a policy inconsistent within the same government of different agencies. For example, one example that I can give you is about is Libya regarding Benghazi. There was a big fallout between the State Department and Department of Defense in terms of how they wanted to operate in Libya, right? And especially after this killing of the American diplomat there, Hillary Clinton had a very strong spat with the Department of Defense, because Department of Defense wanted to act in one way, whereas the State Department wanted to act on a different way, right? So usually, if you see in the diplomacy, there is always one line of thought from the State Department, which basically is in control of the foreign policy, but sometimes there is a different interest that is growing within the military circle, especially on the defense. So we can always see this kind of, a kind of a divorce between their policies sometimes. I saw that firsthand when I was working in Nepal. I was invited in England by DFID during the peace process of Nepal. So I was with their guests. Basically, they wanted to understand with me, because at that time we were in a process of integrating the Maoist soldiers into the national military, and obviously Nepal was a small country, and because of the wartime, our military almost increased by twofold. So the thought from the civil society and also the prescription from the academia was to reduce the size of the military. So DFID was basically kind of subscribing our views that the military should be downsized, and the integration between the Maoist soldiers and the Nepalese military should take place. So that was kind of a official kind of a policy of the European Union, most of the donor agencies, and also the civil society. So when I went to England, obviously, basically they wanted to understand in terms of the functioning, how the process goes, because we were designing the process, so they would really wanted to understand us, because they were the biggest funders of the DDR process in Nepal. So my meeting with the DFID and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the British government was basically they wanted to see the size of the Nepalese military to be downsized, and they want a civilian control over the Nepalese military, meaning that there should be a kind of a structure, and the military should be under the president or under the prime minister, and there should be a clear rule in terms of who is going to control the entire military, right? So, and then I was also invited by the Department of Defense, by the military side, in terms of giving me kind of their prescription in terms of how they wanted to see the military, and especially the defense and the British military didn't want Nepalese military to be downsized, because their vision and their kind of analysis was Nepalese military is one of the most professional military in South Asia, so it should be made more stronger. We should not really talk about the civilian control over the military. right? So there, it was completely opposite view of what I was, getting from the State Department or from the Foreign Office, right? Because the British military had a traditional relationship with the Nepalese military. They were fighting together for the last 200 years. So obviously they don't want Nepalese military to be downsized. They don't want Nepalese military to be cropped with different powers they have. So so even the same government might have a different policy. So usually if we see in the policy side of a same government, there is always inconsistency in the policy. And then we always, kind of notice that, especially with the bigger countries like even United States or United Kingdom or European Union, even German, within the German, there is always a kind of a policy inconsistent with the Foreign Office or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with the defense. That is seen clearly now in Iraq, that is clearly seen in Afghanistan and also in Syria in terms of the military side of the same government with the foreign affairs. There is always a kind of a inconsistency that we can also see in this process, and also within the donor agencies in terms of, for example, if there is a conflict situation and if we are going in a post-conflict situation, different donor agency has a different views in terms of how things should be done, right? I've never seen, I've worked in Nepal, I worked in Afghanistan, I worked in Sri Lanka, I've never seen a kind of a coherent policy that they agree on. The United Nations want to see one thing to be done, one kind of a vision, then obviously the American wants to see with their USAID, different vision in terms of how they wanted to see the solution of that conflict or solution of the problem or the challenges that is facing. The British has their own kind of a version in terms of how things should be done, so there is always a kind of a conflict within their own policies, how things really works. Okay, let me give you a kind of an example in terms of how big international organization basically does their analysis. And every bigger donor agency, whether we call United Nations or if we talk about CARE International, or if we talk about Save the Children, or if we talk about ActionAid, they have their own framework of conflict analysis in terms of how they wanted to do analysis. For example, United Nations has their own framework of doing conflict analysis. CARE International, I'm showing this of CARE International, have their own framework of doing analysis. Then Save the Children has their own. So every donor agencies, every big international organization, international non-government organization have their own framework of doing this analysis. And this is very important to know because, for example, obviously most of you, and most of you were also working for this kind of organization, basically you follow whatever the framework that they are prescribing, right? For example, I used to be consultant for many organizations. I used to be consultant for UNDP, UNICEF. I also did some consultancy with CARE International. I did consultancy with Save the Children. So when I was a consultant, I was compelled to follow their framework in terms of doing things, right? So there is a kind of a set framework that is always there. So this is the framework of CARE International in terms of how they do a kind of analysis. So they do kind of a timeline. That is a big thing in terms of really understanding how the history and the context of the conflict. They do the actor mapping, really trying to understand who are the actors involved, and then obviously underlying cause of conflict. So in terms of the conflict timeline, they kind of develop this kind of timeline, really trying to understand when is the crisis time, when is the point of de-escalation, right? Because every conflict has this, kind of a zigzag timeline in terms of conflict. Sometimes escalate and sometimes de-escalates, right? And then the actor mapping, obviously, this is how they do actors. Who are the primary actors? Who are the secondary actors? What are their relationship with these actors? And then where is CARE International? What is their relations with different actors? So trying to understand, as a multilateral organization, who, trying to really understand who are the actors and then who are basically we can work with. Right? And then in terms of the root cause, they also follow this iceberg model, basically trying to see, the immediate cause and some of the underlying root cause and some of the deep root causes of the conflict. And then they question themselves, at which level is CARE best place to work? Looking at the various causes of the conflict, where CARE International can work and at which level. So basically, this is one of the model which is of CARE International. Now I go into the praxis realm. So in praxis realm, basically conflict analysis is used by all development workers. I talked about do no harm. This is also one aspect of conflict analysis. This is one tool of conflict analysis. Conflict sensitivity development is also another big conflict analysis tool. So there are various tools that we as a development practitioners used in our day-to-day life. So obviously, sometimes we're assigned to work in, for example, if I'm assigned to work in Myanmar, obviously my role is to basically understand that country, right? Understand the various aspect of that country, cultural, socioeconomic, political, so obviously, as a development practice, obviously we really need to understand how the things really goes on that country, particular country, right? Then obviously, you are also assigned to work in a certain district, or, you are placed in, you as a head of a certain district, obviously then my duty would be to understand the various dynamics that goes in that particular state where I've been assigned to work, right? To really understand, to really map out who are the actors who are involved, right? If there is a conflict ongoing, for example, we are asked to do to work and intervene on the Rohingya situation, obviously we need to map that conflict, right? Who are the primary actors in this conflict? Who are the secondary actors? Who are the other actors who are working? And as a development worker, obviously you also need to understand who are the different actors, who are the different donors who are basically working in this region, who are the different NGOs that is working, and what is their relationship. So even in our professional life, it's very important really to analyze this situation so that it will be much easier for us to work, right? Because it improves efforts to prevent and respond to the violent conflict and mass atrocities by accurately identifying and prioritizing factors driving conflict and supporting peace. We're not only trying to really understand the deep root cause. Obviously that is one of the very important aspects of conflict analysis, but obviously after doing conflict analysis we can also devise ways in terms of how we can intervene in that conflict, right? We can also know who are the actors who are working for peace, right? Who are those actors who are basically unifying people, right? So that can also be kind of mapped using this tool, right? Who are those who are basically not supporters of peace, right? So obviously we can also understand this. I don't want to go on to this. Can you click on the first documentary? I just wanted to say one thing is basically conflict assessment or analysis is also different based on your own field. For example, we have students here in environment, and then obviously we have a student from peace education, we have student from gender, we have student from IPS. So within this field also, they have a different view of doing analysis of the same conflict, right? So I'm trying to show you a documentary of
and great powers.
I've spent decades reporting on the Middle East, but I have to say, the events in Syria these days are some of the most heartbreaking I have ever seen. I thought I knew how it all started, with protests over government repression and widespread poverty in early 2011. But then I met Farah Nassif, a young Syrian refugee living here in Washington, D.C.
They are talking about rap when I was young.
She said I couldn't understand. This drought. I also come across a confidential U.S. diplomatic cable. A UN official stationed in Syria
Climate change
feared the
and
drought
Syrian
was...
She also didn't cover the actual subject that she was supposed to cover. Like, she was funny. She had some great stories. But, and it may just be my context, but the way she worded the what about men thing just struck me as, like, in the U.S., that's what anti-feminists do, like, use that exact phrase, basically,
So basically, in this two documentary, what I'm saying is one analysis is done by the environmentalist looking at the Syrian conflict, whereas the other analysis is done by the conflict, basically the political scientist. Okay, what's the first one?
Climate Change and the Syrian Civil War, a presentation based on the ECC Factbook. More than 220,000 people dead, countless more wounded, and no end in sight. The situation in Syria is dire. Since protests started in March 2011, the conflict has intensified to become one of the worst in recent decades. Until today, it has caused almost half of the population to flee their homes. The direct causes of the Syrian crisis relate to popular discontent with the authoritarian regime of Bashar al-Assad. Yet, a number of experts have highlighted the roles of climate change, drought, and poor resource management as additional factors behind the Syrian crisis. In fact, the Syrian case offers important insights into how environmental factors can feed into popular grievances and, in combination with other social factors, produce widespread violence and suffering. The following analysis is based on the conceptual model identifying possible links between the conflict in Syria and climate change. Over the past decades, the Mediterranean littoral zone and the Middle East have warmed up considerably, leading to an intensification of drought cycles. Of the 12 driest winters hitting the region since 1902, 10 have occurred in just the last 20 years. According to a study from the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, this change towards drier conditions cannot be explained by natural variability alone. Anthropogenic greenhouse gases and aerosol forcing, as well as increases in sea surface temperature, are major contributing factors as well. A particularly serious drought hit the region between 2006 and 2010. In Syria, the consequences were disastrous, especially in the northeastern part of the country. As a consequence of crop failures and plummeting livestock numbers, an estimated 2 to 3 million people were driven into extreme poverty. The impact of drought was compounded by the unsustainable water policies that the Ba'ath Party government has implemented for years. To win public support, it pursued overambitious agricultural projects, provided subsidies for water-intensive crops and inefficient irrigation methods, and turned a blind eye to unsustainable patterns of water consumption, including thousands of unlicensed black wells. As a consequence, local aquifers have been decreasing at an alarming rate. The Syrian government's actions and omissions thus played a significant role in increasing water scarcity. These environmental and social causes had several direct effects. Droughts and water scarcity caused a loss of livelihoods and a scarcity in survival resources. By 2011, the droughts had left an estimated 1 million Syrian civilians in extreme food insecurity. This resulted in a large exodus of farmers and herders to urban areas, thereby increasing competition for housing, jobs, and access to services. A shock in food prices stirred nationwide unrest. People became increasingly upset with the government, which did little to address their desperate situation. Besides a rift between the people and their government, the situation also brought about grievances between different societal groups. These dynamics played out in a particularly volatile political context. Before 2011, many Syrians already held strong grievances against the Assad regime relating to political oppression and corruption, and the example of revolutions in other Arab countries was obviously important in triggering the original protests in Syria. These grievances largely resulted from biased agricultural policies. From 2000 on, the Assad regime had favoured the expansion of private agribusinesses held by a small group of elite supporters and had lifted important subsidies for smallholders. Furthermore, when drought conditions hit the country in 2006, the government was quite reluctant in assisting the drought-stricken population and even in acknowledging the gravity of the situation, which strongly contributed to popular discontent. In fact, the droughts played a proximate role in exacerbating structural political problems, without which the Syrian crisis would probably not have reached its actual proportions. The international community has repeatedly attempted to negotiate peace, yet, These efforts have so far failed in the face of seemingly incompatible positions by the warring parties and some of their outside backers. Several donors provide funds to UN humanitarian operations in order to address the basic needs of the population. However, these remain underfunded, although this may improve as the European Union seeks to stem the tide of Syrian refugees fleeing to Europe. To resolve the environmental dimension of the Syrian civil war, many other conflict resolution measures will be necessary. Most of these can, however, only be initiated once the violence of the conflict abates. One crucial element will be the diversification of the Syrian economy, with a view to lessening the importance of the agricultural sector, combined with stronger social safeguards. Likewise, improving the water infrastructure and water management will be an essential factor. All measures would need to be accompanied by a stronger legal framework, increased cooperation, the cessation of violence, and a general increase in state capacity. Overall, the situation has dramatically deteriorated since 2011. The emergence of ISIS has further complicated the conflict, as has the increasingly direct intervention of regional and great powers. Millions of refugees and migrants represent a major challenge for countries neighbouring Syria and beyond, and there is no end in sight for the suffering of the Syrian population. Much is yet to be done to resolve the conflict. This analysis, as well as all graphs and data shown, are available at factbook.ecc-platform.org.
Close this one. Close this one. Go to my slide. Yeah. The first one. Yes. So this is a political analysis now. The same conflict.
Syria's war is a mess. After 6 years, the conflict is divided between 4 sides, each side with foreign backers, and those foreign backers don't even agree with each other on who they're fighting for and who they're fighting against. And now, Syria's use of chemical weapons has provoked President Donald Trump to directly attack Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. This is a major development because up until now, the US has only been focused on fighting ISIS. To understand the crisscrossing interventions and battle lines in Syria today and how it got this way, it helps to go back to the beginning of the conflict and watch to see how it unfolded. The first shots in the war were fired in March 2011 by Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad against peaceful Arab Spring demonstrators. In July, the protesters start shooting back, and some Syrian troops even defect from the Syrian army to join them. They call themselves the Free Syrian Army, and the uprising becomes a civil war. Extremists from around the region and the world start traveling to Syria to join the rebels. Now, Assad actually encourages this by releasing jihadist prisoners to tinge the rebellion with extremism and make it harder for foreign backers to support them. In January 2012, Al-Qaeda forms a new branch in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra. Also around that time, Syrian Kurdish groups who had long sought autonomy take up arms and informally secede from Assad's rule in the north. That summer is when Syria becomes a proxy war. Iran, Assad's most important ally, intervenes on his behalf, and by the end of 2012, Iran is sending daily cargo flights and has hundreds of officers on the ground. At the same time, the oil-rich Arab states in the Persian Gulf begin sending money and weapons to the rebels, mainly to counter Iran's influence. Iran steps up its influence in turn in mid-2012 when Hezbollah, a Lebanese militia backed by Iran, invades to fight along Assad. In turn, the Gulf states respond, Saudi Arabia really stepping up this time to send more money and weapons to the rebels, this time through Jordan, who also opposes Assad. By 2013, the Middle East is divided between mostly Sunni powers generally supporting the rebels and Shias generally supporting Assad. That April, the Obama administration, horrified by Assad's atrocities and the mounting death toll, signs a secret order authorizing the CIA to train and equip Syrian rebels. But the program stalls. At the same time, the US quietly urges Arab Gulf states to stop funding extremists, but their requests basically go ignored. In August, the Assad regime uses chemical weapons against civilians, provoking condemnation from around the world.
Men, women, children lying in rows, killed by poison gas. It is in the national security interests of the United States to respond to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons through a targeted military strike.
Russia proposed on Monday that Syria surrender control over its chemical weapons to the international community for its eventual dismantling to avoid a U.S. military strike.
The US ends up backing down, but the whole thing establishes Syria as a great powers dispute, with Russia backing Assad and the US opposing him. Just weeks later, the first American CIA training in arms reached Syrian rebels. The US is now a participant in the war. In February 2014, something happens that transforms the war. An Al-Qaeda affiliate based mostly in Iraq breaks away from the group over internal disagreements. The group calls itself the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, and it becomes Al-Qaeda's enemy. ISIS mostly fights not Assad, but other rebels and Kurds, carving out a mini-state it calls its caliphate. That summer, it marches across Iraq, seizing territory and galvanizing the world against it. In September, 1 year after US almost bombed Assad, it begins bombing ISIS.
We're moving ahead with our campaign of airstrikes against these terrorists, and we're prepared to take action against ISIL in Syria as well.
That summer, in July, the Pentagon launches its own program to train Syrian rebels, but will only train those who will fight ISIS, not Assad. The program fizzles, showing that America now opposes ISIS more than Assad, but that there's also no like-minded Syrian proxy forces on the ground in Syria. In August, Turkey starts bombing Kurdish groups in Iraq and in Turkey, even as these Kurdish groups are fighting ISIS in Syria. But Turkey doesn't bomb ISIS. This gets to one of the big problems in this conflict. The US sees ISIS as its main enemy, but the US's allies like Turkey and a lot of Middle Eastern states have other priorities. This makes for a lot of unclear and confusing alliances. The next month, in September, Russia intervenes on behalf of Assad, sending a few dozen military aircraft to a long-held Russian base in the country. Russia says it's there to bomb ISIS, but in fact only ends up bombing anti-Assad rebels, including some backed by the US. The next year, Donald Trump wins the White House, vowing to stay out of Syria and signaling that Assad should be able to stay in power. At the end of 2016, Assad, helped by Russian air power and Iranian-sponsored militias, retakes the Syrian city of Aleppo, knocking the rebels out of their last remaining urban stronghold. Then, in spring 2017, Assad once again uses chemical weapons against his people, killing 85, including 20 children. Back in the US, Trump says his attitude towards Syria and Assad has, quote, changed very much due to the attacks. He vows to respond, and within just a few days, the White House launches dozens of Tomahawk missiles that strike an airbase in Syria. This is the first time the United States has directly attacked the Assad regime, and this adds yet another crisscrossing complication to the already multi-dimensional civil war. So as it stands now, Syria is in ruins. Even as Assad recaptures land, the rebellion perseveres, and with outside countries fueling each of the groups, it's clear that there's still no end in sight.
Okay, I think this gave you two perspectives of looking at Syrian war. Thanks to the Koreans, now we do not talk about this anymore. Yes?
What is that site?
I'll send you the thing. They basically also analyze different conflicts. So I'll send you so you can get that. Comments, thoughts? Yes?
The allegations that the Assad regime is directly responsible for the chemical attacks, those are still contested. And it's not to say the Assad regime is not brutal and a dictatorship and violent. However, it's worth acknowledging in that video, they made really clear-cut lines of the Free Syrian Army and how some of them became disaffected soldiers and joined ISIS, but it's much more nuanced than that. And at this point, who are the rebellious Free Syrian Army? It's very convoluted, and a lot of sources and a lot of people insist they are in fact responsible for the chlorine gas attacks and not the Assad regime, and that was deliberately propaganda from the US for regime change and to justify intervening in the conflict.
I agree on that point. In fact, this was exactly my analysis, because obviously we also have to remember just before that sarin gas attack.
Facilitated removing the
Exactly. Not only that, even President Trump, openly announced that they are not interested in regime change in Syria. So in fact, Assad was winning everything. So if you are winning everything, obviously you are not so stupid to do those things. So there is a big conspiracy in terms of who did that. So you rightly pointed out on one aspect. It's basically the Free Syrian Army. So there is also some indication that they are the ones who are responsible. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I just wanted to also kind of hear from others in terms of really understanding this conflict from different perspectives. One from the environmental perspective, which has not really been really talked about, but obviously that is also one of the big factor fueling this conflict. Obviously there is also great power kind of dynamics, which is another aspect of looking this conflict. Any thoughts on that? Yes?
I thought it's a kind of political analysis. Do you have any idea of the economic benefits, especially the petroleum and some oil from the Syria, and the relationship between Turkey, Russia, United States, and the Persian Gulf? Economic benefits, I mean.
Well, obviously oil is one of the big aspects, but obviously more than that, I think sometimes great power also needs to kind of showcase, their kind of a power. So demonstrate, right? So that is also another thing, especially in the international politics. For example, whatever North Korea is doing, obviously, I'm pretty sure that it's not really doing without go ahead from China. So basically, China is making some statement, within really trying to chase the United States away from that. And since 2 days, it's very clear in terms of what Russia and China really wants in the Korean Peninsula, right? So obviously, this is always a kind of a game basically they play, right, in order to really reiterating their own kind of their power. So right. So I think this was also one of the kind of a sad truth in terms of why so many actors are really involved there, because basically it's a kind of a Middle East kind of game. So that is really going on that, and Syria is a kind of a stage where all these actors are playing. But on top of that, I think the other political economy aspect is also weapons. There is clearly, a kind of a political economy that is going on the weapons in terms of who is selling the weapons, and predominantly there are two powers who are basically gaining from this, basically the United States and Russia, who are selling weapons to different allies, right? So the more conflict you can create, the more market you can generate. For example, the whole Korean context, the whole Korean nuclear crisis context can also be leveled from that point of view. Obviously, there is a direct threat to the United States on this conflict, but at the same time, the United States can now sell, 2 times the weapons that it is selling previous years, and especially the buyers would be Korea and Japan. So, that's also another political economy aspect of this.
Thank you. I have one comment. Basically, I find problematic the whole conflict analysis because it doesn't go into historical perspectives. We cannot look, especially the complexity of this conflict, which is related to what happened in Egypt as an Arab Spring, and then turning into military junta and etc. And then we cannot also look at separately from what happened during the Cold War, because this is de facto Cold War in a territory there. So this is one aspect I wanted to stress. And the other aspect is the fact that the Trump's attack of Syria is really hypocritical, because on one hand he is bringing these orders on refugee migrants or refugee prohibitions who come from Middle East, and on the other hand is bombing the people there who are already suffering. So it's a huge mess.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I also agree with you, especially when we have to do conflict analysis. Obviously, it should not be kind of a superficial. Obviously, we need to go back to the history. And obviously, the whole Syrian context also has a lot of historical factor in terms of why it emerged at this point of time. Okay, Yeah, you were raising the hands.
I just wanted to say that it also oversimplified the Kurdish position in Syria.
It was not really been shown so much.
Right.
Definitely.
I actually did a paper. I did a conflict analysis on
okay.
Rojava last year, and I could have gotten some things wrong, but the current primary Kurdish party that is in control of Rojava, the Democratic Union Party, doesn't want secession from Syria. They want a more autonomous,
autonomous
state
region
within Syria.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. But obviously, that also kind of provokes a kind of a conflict with Turkey. Obviously, there are other in Iraq, and obviously in Syria. So it's a kind of a mess in terms of their position also. Yes. Okay. So let's go ahead in terms of really progressing. One of the book that I can recommend, especially on the praxis side, is from Lisa Surik. It's Conflict Assessment and Peace Building Planning. It's also available in our library. I just summarize this. Basically, she asks this different question in terms of understanding the conflict. So the question that she poses is, where is conflict taking place? Are government institutions functioning? Who in terms of the actors? Why in terms of the reasons? What? So different kind of different driving and the mitigating factors. Obviously, I'm just going on a surfacely. She basically explains very detailedly on that. I can also send you some of the major portion of this book. There is in fact also an online training that Lisa Surik basically gives free of cost. In her site, I can also recommend that. It's a 1 hour kind of a class that she takes, and I really recommend. I can send you the link today. So I recommend you to go through all this, because she basically explained in terms of how to go in each of these questions, in terms of understanding a kind of a conflict. And then when. So she also talks about the history as well as the future timeline of the conflict. If you look into the conflict analysis, conflict mapping, conflict assessment, there are so many tools. Each organization have their own tool. Each scholars, they develop their own frame, unit of analysis. For example, basically, if we kind of map most of this conflict mapping or conflict analysis tool, these are some of the indicators which are basically common. So history of the conflict, obviously that is one very important aspect really to understand any conflict. Basically, because anything that is happening here or any point of time obviously had some historical background, right? So we should not also kind of forget that and really try to understand that. Then obviously the conflict context in terms of how the conflict is evolving. The other important aspect is conflict parties. Obviously, we really need to understand the primary parties, but at the same time there are multiple secondary parties who are also involved in those conflicts. So one of the important aspects is to also understand those parties, those secondary parties who has stake in this conflict. One of my colleague, who is also one of the big name in this field, is Luc Reckler. He's a professor at University of Leuven, who also talks about the profiteers of war. So who are these people who are profiting from this war? So you will also need to understand, who are these people who are really trying to, profit from whatever is going on, right? So that is also another actor that we really need to understand. Then obviously conflict issues, and then how conflict is kind of really going on in that particular context. Okay, so I don't want to go much detail. I think I'll send you these slides and you can go into this. I've just put some of the questions, on all those actors, all those elements. So when we know the actors and we map all the actors, we can kind of draw this kind of a diagram in order to really make us aware in terms of their relationship, also in terms of different actors which we are mapped. When we have all the reasons, from the historical context, then we can kind of draw this kind of figure in terms of understanding the root cause of conflict. And then the dynamics can be reflected in this kind of diagram. Okay. This is one framework that I developed. Actually, I mapped about 13 different conflicts. And then based on that 13 different conflicts, I came up a kind of a kind of a common element that is seen across these 13 different conflicts. Majority of those conflicts were basically undergoing in different Asian contexts and also in African contexts. So out of this analysis, I came up some of the determinants of violence. So if we look into most of the conflict, basically there are 5 determinants that we can see. One is the cultural dimension. So all the conflict has some kind of a cultural or cognitive dimensions, which is basically alienation of culture, race, ethnicity, religion. So that is one of the big reason for people to rebel. The other is obviously political dimension, and we see across all societies in every countries there is political exclusion and disenfranchisement. For example, let's say in various countries, who are the representation in politics. For example, if we talk about the gender, almost every country is in the world. I don't think so Costa Rica is one country, because now Costa Rica is trying to have a 50-50 balance in the parliament, but in most of the countries, obviously, male are the dominant actors in the politics, right, in the position of power. So, that is also another big issues, and obviously across ethnicity, across, different factors that is present in that context. Then there is a social dimension, which is social exclusion and discriminations. Obviously, this is also one of the common factors we see in every society, every community, every country, every region. And obviously, the big factor is economic exclusion and poverty, right? Either we talk about America, or we talk about even advanced country like Germany, or even Sweden, right? The most rich countries, the most happy country that we have, right? And then there is a resource dimension, because not only there are human dimension, but there are also resource actors, right? Resource factors that basically alienates people, right? The best example I can give is those people who lives in mountains obviously do not have free access to everything, vis-a-vis those people who lives in plain, right? Even the nature becomes a kind of a factor of exclusion, with different services. For example, a children who lives in the mountain of Nepal has to walk 2 hours to go to a school. Whereas, people who, the children who lives in the plain down south only has to walk about 5 minutes to go to school, right? So these are, kind of a simple aspect in terms of how resource, and obviously resource dimensions are a different thing. Some areas are highly resourceful, so they can have employment and everything, whereas at some part, obviously resource is a constraint, right? But one other aspect, and that is basically missed by most of this conflict analysis tool, is the exclusion of obviously female, that is always there, but also the youth, because if you see the majority of the armed conflict, especially interstate conflict, the majority of people who are fighting, or the majority of population who are fighting, are the younger people. For example, in the Maoist insurgency in Nepal, which started in 1996 and ended in 2006, majority of the fighting force were the young people from age 12 up. So, and in their force, especially from age 12 to 16, almost 1/3 of the fighting force were there, right? So that is because they are excluded almost in all this dynamics, right? Because if you see in most poor and developing countries, younger generation, younger people do not have any opportunities. So for example, it's very easy for the rebel group to really recruit these people, because since your government is not giving an opportunity, at least these people, is basically, kind of giving you a dream that, they will basically, create an equality. They are giving you a job to fight for them. At least, they are giving some money, which can be paid to buy food for their own family, right? At least they are giving food, right? If you are fighting for them, obviously they'll feed you, right? So that is an opportunity that is being given and presented to them when there are no opportunities. So that is one reason why majority of this conflict that we see in Africa and Asia, majority of the people fighting are children and young people. And that's a reality. That's a hardcore reality, right? So obviously, with this, all exclusion makes a kind of a threshold to the violent conflict. And obviously, there are some moments, events that triggers the violence. Either there is a domestic violent leadership, because these are embedded in each and every society. What the Johan Galtung talks about, the structural side. So all the structural beats are already there. So there needs to be a leadership who really needs to justify violence in their name. And then obviously there are also interested parties who might fund whole attack, the whole kind of a game. So in this, how the violent conflict really is created. Okay. So obviously, looking into these elements, obviously, I also kind of come up with some of the solutions. So obviously, in order to work on that, we need a kind of a cultural integration and affirmation, right? But that is a kind of a generational aspect. For example, we all know that untouchability in South Asia is wrong, right? And especially my generation, obviously, we do that, we practice that. But obviously, the older generation in our society really are not, accepting that fact, right? So it's a kind of a generational thing. It does not happen right away. You make a, kind of a rule, and then, the things will disappear next day, right? It takes, at least 2-3 generations for that to happen, right? It's the same thing with the same-sex marriage that we are seeing all over the world, right? People accept it, we accept it, but obviously, in order for a wider societal acceptance, obviously it needs generation, at least 5 generations or 10 generations to really, to have it as a kind of a normal kind of, practices, right? So that is also a very difficult thing that, obviously we expect everything overnight, but obviously that's not going to happen, right? It takes generation and generation to go into that. This one is quite easy, but at the same time, political struggle sometimes makes it very difficult to really go on to that. For example, I can give you example from Nepal. So right after the insurgency in Nepal and after the peace process, we have a rule, and Nepalese government devised a rule that every party needs to kind of create a balance in terms of the people they are fielding candidates. So all the ethnicity, all the gender components should be fulfilled. So for example, in the gender component, every political party should at least fulfill 33% of the total seats. So 1/3 of the seats should be for the women. Not only that, we also devised, we had first past post the system, which is basically direct election. We also kind of devised a proportional representation, meaning that the equal number of votes that they received on the first past post the system, the political party also gets the same number of political seats in the parliament. So in the proportional representation, the political party needs to balance all the representation. So for example, in the first past the post system, if there are not enough women which are being elected directly, in the proportional representation, all the political party needs to send to balance that 33% quota that every political party. So if you look into the parliament of Nepal, 33% of the, more than 40%, now it stands about 40% of the parliamentarians are women, okay? Very good, it's going very good. But the problem is, who are these people, right? Either it's the daughter, for example, now it's a great example. Our president is a woman. Our Speaker of the House is a woman. Our Chief Justice till 2 months ago was a woman. So all the major power holders, except the prime ministers and some cabinet position, were all women. But if you look deeply, the president who is sitting right now became president because her husband died at one point of time. So the political party decided, because her husband was the founding of this party. So the presidential post is a ceremonial post. So our political party decided to field her as a president. It's not because he basically fight to be on that, but basically it was a kind of a, given to somebody because her husband had a great contribution, to this political party, and since the political party has the majority, so they sent, right? The same with the speaker. The speaker came to the position because right after the election, the husband got sick. Who was thought to be the prime minister, he got sick, so he was seriously ill. So the political party decided, because of the contribution of the husband who is now ill and is bedridden, so decided to send, his wife to be the speaker, right? And this is the case even in the parliamentarian. There is hardly people who really fought in the politics become the kind of a representation, because political party and basically political leadership use that proportional representation to basically elect their own wives, their daughters, or whatever it is. So that becomes a kind of a tool, right? So it's not a kind of a real representation of the real people, right? It's basically a kind of a pseudo representation, right? There is a representation, it's great, but who are representing that is a kind of a question mark. And this happens in everywhere. In South Asia, it's much more prevalent. In South Asia, we have leaders like very great leaders, women leaders. In Sri Lanka, we had Bandara Naike family who were ruling Sri Lanka for a very long period of time. In Bangladesh, there are 2 women who are ruling. They are doing hide and seek because Begum Khalida Zia, and I forgot the name of the other one, Sheikh Hasina. So they basically becomes, they basically share the power every time. But in terms of the real representation of women, it's always a questionable. So they are the only ones who get the power every time, right? So whenever there is an election, we are sure that the next prime minister is going to be woman in Bangladesh. Yes. Oh yes, that's always the case. Exactly. Well, now at least the good part in India, even though I'm not a great supporter of the current government, but at least at least now this prime minister, despite his all other other criticism that I have, but at least he tried to bring people in the cabinet. For example, recently, I think day before yesterday, he nominated a defense minister as a woman. So it's one of the most powerful position. And then at least he tries to kind of balance. And then the people also comes, obviously not from the Oxford and all these things. Obviously these are people. But yes, that is majority kind of a problem in South Asia. Either we talk about the politics in Pakistan in terms of who are basically coming to power, or and I think this has become a kind of a global standard. Even in America, I'll not be surprised in 10 years another Obama will emerge as the president of America, because now election and politics is very expensive affair. So obviously we'll see businessmen, power politicians to be in that position, right? Because now simply the whole criticism of politics has become very expensive. So very few people can really afford to play that game. Simple. That is the simple fact, right? Who are the candidates? For example, recently we had an election in Nepal. Each candidate, and this is very interesting because this was a local election, so there is a kind of an allegation in Kathmandu, especially in the Kathmandu metropolitan, which is the capital city. So the mayor of the Kathmandu city spent more than $100,000 in order to win. And we're talking about Nepal, right? We're talking 100,000 is a big money. You'll have basically an upper middle class lifestyle if you have that kind of money, but you need to spend that much of money to win the election, right? And that was a kind of a allegation that was being put forward because the ceiling was only $5,000. That was the ceiling, but most of the candidates they had to spend more than $100,000 to win that position. So that is how politics works. So that is another thing. Even though that looks very simple, social democratization, participation, equity. Obviously, that is also something that comes with the politics and other things. This is one of the biggest challenges that we face all over the world, especially the transformation of economy, productivity, right? And especially in poor developing countries, this is more challenging in terms of how we kind of create an equality or equal society, especially not only in other aspects, but also on the economic terms, which really matters, right? So that is one challenge in all of the post-conflict societies, because basically in the post-conflict situation, there is always an expectation of the people that their lives would be improved, right? That's a kind of a dream, right? That's what everybody tells us, right? But the reality is quite different. There are very few people who basically, benefit from the system, and especially on this liberal economic model that is really not going to happen. Sometimes I also argue that it's, for example, when I talk about India and China, for me, I think Chinese system is much more, easy in order to maintain the equality, because at least there is central power. So Chinese government at one point of time can say to all its citizens that please give all the money because we wanted to distribute all to the people, right? They can do that, right? But in India, it's not so easy, right? Because there are structures, right? There are few people who have access to this money, and then the society is becoming more and more unequal the time we go. Because in democracy, we cannot say that you cannot earn more money, right? So, that's the system, right? So if you have tricks, you can earn as much as you can. There is no kind of a bar that can be put to the people saying that you cannot earn more money than this. So sometimes the economic model that we are going in is not really kind of compatible to the dreams that we are trying to sell to all the people, all the poor people. And the other thing is, I think what Alonso taught is also this whole problem with the production system, the whole problem with the economic model that we are kind of going through. We're talking about production, we're talking about manufacturing, we're talking about consumption, right? So we are changing our mobile phone every 6 months because iPhone has just released a new set. So obviously we want that. right? I remember that when we had a TV, I think around 1980s, after I was born, my father bought a TV. I think that TV was in the house for 20 years, right? Now we change TV every month, every year, because there is a new smart TV that came on, because it's curved, it has, it has much more function, it is smart. You can use the TV with the mobile phone, so you have to change it. that's the whole consumption model that we're going through. Because I still remember the Sony TV that my father bought 20 years ago and still working. But no longer my TV is working in the same way. Right? No longer. So my Japanese Sony TV is still working in my ancestral home. My grandfather was watching the same TV, but it no longer works. For example, I came to Costa Rica, I bought a TV. It just went out in a year. I tried to fix it. Nobody's going to fix that TV. It's more expensive to fix that TV. Fix that damn TV. So strange. This is another problem that we are facing, the consumption, right? And then how our economic model is really based on that whole aspect of consumption. The first word of President George Bush after the Twin Tower fell down is go out and buy. Please. that is how, they were trying to fight against the terrorism, so-called terrorism that came to this world, right? So that is also another problem. And then obviously, this is another challenge that the environment is posing to us. Even though most of our leaders are not really accepting this fact, there is a hurricane is going to hit very soon in America, and nobody is really talking about the environmental damage and everything. We're just talking about the hurricane is coming and what impact is going to happen to our economy, not really considering what was basically the problem, right? So that is another problem. And obviously the knowledge on this factor is the basic problem. Okay, so with this, I want to end here. Question, thoughts? Yes. Please.
I've seen in a couple presentations already, you professors are talking a lot about the need to include the voices and the rights and the opinions of women and youth. But so far I haven't seen anything about including the voices and opinions of elders in the society. And, they typically have more rationality, are more grounded, aren't so hot-headed.
No, definitely. But I'm talking, because I come from developing countries where our elders basically controls everything. Mm-hmm. I tried my shot into politics. I'm telling you the truth. I tried my shot into politics. My uncle is also a politician. He's a member of the parliament. He is around, now he's about 55. Mm-hmm. He is considered to be the youth leader because our prime minister is at the age of 80.
Your country,
that's the problem.
It might be an anomaly. I mean, we even have cases in...
This is, I think, the entire context, either we say in the African context or in Asian context. Basically, that is how it works. But obviously, you are very right that, in developed context, even in Japan, that's now a big problem. Because,
It is. You have elder suicide
and we are seeing the population dividend where basically in 20 years, we will see a different dynamics of population. Right, and especially in developed world, like in Japan, in Korea, even in Poland, in most of the developed countries, we are seeing a different dividend of population, and then and their knowledge obviously is very important in terms of how we deal with a lot of these challenges, right? And then obviously there are whole sets of indigenous people, the whole tradition and the whole cultural aspect. Obviously that needs to be done. Thank you very much for pointing on that. Any other? Yes.
So my comment is actually about one of the readings.
Okay.
And I was upset at the use of a certain word.
Uh-huh.
And I just wanted...
Which reading is that?
So it was Galtung's reading.
Okay.
And they used autistic, as a way to describe something they didn't like, like that they developmentally. And this upsets me greatly, because I've worked with children with autism and other special needs. And I find that this kind of use of a mental health diagnosis to describe something we don't like to be a problem, especially because it pacifies, it allows people in other situations to use it
Yeah.
in that way, and it becomes more and more derogatory. It becomes a slur.
Oh, definitely.
And we had that problem. I mean, okay, so we had that problem with the word retardation.
Yeah, even the word disabled now.
Yeah.
It's differently abled now. The word has completely changed in terms of how we, the same word kind of denotes to the people, right?
Yeah.
That's so many.
In the mental health field, we've
Yeah.
had to change the names of diagnoses
Exactly.
because of this problem.
Yes.
And so I'm just asking my fellow scholars to avoid using mental health diagnoses to describe behavior or development you don't like. Find a different word instead.
Definitely.
Please.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Any? Yes.
Well, I'm just curious, like you said, like we should find a new terms to use, but can you tell us like what exactly words that you prefer and you think it would be, everyone would agree on that term?
Can you, I think one of the best thing, one solution is, can you do a kind of a brown bag? Because we also wanted to be aware, because, because since, we do not work on that field, and then we really do not understand in terms of how things are really shaping in that field. So sometimes that also becomes a kind of a problematic, because we are used to with certain kind of word. For example, I also started using, not using disabled rather than differently abled, because I was asked to work with some of the differently abled people in Nepal in terms of the employment thing, and then they corrected me. Now we no longer use this word, because now there is a different word in terms of, because if you are calling somebody disabled, obviously they are not disabled. Right? They are differently able. So that was a kind of a correct word. I think I recommend you to do a brown bag so we can all be aware. And thank you very much for that. Okay, so what I want you to do is to go to your class exactly at 10:30 dot. Okay, and thank you very much. It was pleasure being with you all, and hopefully we'll meet again.